Thank you, everybody, and especially Juliana for this lovely introduction that makes me all shy, and everyone who has made this conference and this fantastic event today possible. It's great to be back here. It's also great to see old friends and make new friends. But to speak after Alfredo's deeply impressive presentation is both a privilege and it is difficult. As I suppose you all did, I went through the galleries of this beautiful and history-heavy space to see a beautiful and a history-heavy exhibition. And when it comes to the burden of history, the combination with the other exhibition devoted to the history of the Haus der Kunst makes all the sense in the world. To limit myself to the exhibition that we are discussing today, I would like to compliment the curators wholeheartedly to have mounted an exhibition on the subject of which we can only say it is difficult. This phrase is the frame of my comments, and so you will see that I'm a long-term fan of Alfredo's work. My response is not comprehensive, but I'm just going to make some remarks about where I come from in this connection to this exhibition and what it has meant for me. The curators have made a fantastic show. They have done this with thoughtfulness, care, and consideration for the delicacy of its subject, while not shying away from incisive choices. It makes us think beyond what Georges Didier-Berman has called the eternal textbook opposition between Aufklärung and Einfühlung. But how does it manage this difficult task, and to what end? This is the question that lies at the heart of our symposium. Comparison with other exhibitions on the subject of war, violence, and suffering makes this clear. I will make 2 points, 2 compliments that, in my view, make the exhibition significantly stand out among its predecessors and peers. One concerns an absence, the other a multitude. What is so difficult about it? Responding intuitively to the in-your-face quality of a medium that is traditionally associated with truth, usually when seeing photographs of suffering, I feel grief, compassion, anger, fury, and powerlessness. But those feelings have nowhere to go. These images are just videos and photographs, both real and distant, both private and utterly public. A moment both unique and extended beyond the grave. Can I be a witness? Is the artist a witness? I'm not witnessing anyone's suffering when I'm in these galleries. What then is the point? Effect, message, aesthetic of such photographs? If history is, according to Walter Benjamin, as George also reminded us this afternoon, a history of suffering, we may wonder if art gives us aesthetics or anesthetics to deal with this suffering. Or worse, photography of violence can be a potential lure for a sadomasochistic viewing. Violence pornography, I call it. Of all works in the exhibition, and there are many, not a single one caters to such an appropriating gaze. That's the absence that I want to praise here. This is my compliment concerning absence, and I think it is really important. In consequence, please practice a critical gaze on my PowerPoint. All images from the exhibition that I will show without further commentary on them are meant as counter-images to the problems that I'm outlining, not examples of them. I have seen many exhibitions with reporting on violence and conflict as its main topic. Let me single out one as a worthy antecedent. How do you say this? I don't know. In 2005, I received a request to contribute an essay to a catalog for one such exhibition, planned for the following year at the Williams College Museum of Art in Massachusetts. The initiator and organizer was Mark T. Reinhardt, a political scientist I have since learned to know and appreciate as one of the finest, most subtle critics of contemporary political art. The title of the exhibition and the book was exceptionally clear, programmatic, and if taken ironically, critical. The title was Beautiful Suffering, Photography and the Traffic in Pain. It was so clear that I immediately turned the invitation down. My negative response was in line with an earlier reflection published as an article in my book Double Exposures called The Politics of Citation. There I had argued through close analyses of illustrated publications that reproducing images of an objectionable nature is exploitative of suffering and stages a colonizing gaze, even potentially sadistic, pornographic, inevitably. Even if the text accompanying the photographs was an incisive critique of them. One of my cases was this famous book, The Colonial Harem, that I love to hate. Something of the object of critique tends to stick to the text. The visual image also reiterates its primary effect. And the moralizing finger-pointing of a later critic indicting an earlier time seemed disingenuous in the face of the ongoing present tense of violence and exploitation. This theme of the present tense will come back. But as I tend to do in such cases, when Reinhardt insisted, I suggested he send me a folder with images to take a look, to confirm my rejection, I thought. When I received the images, it became clear that the curators had collected them in order to raise exactly the problems, the issues that so bothered me. This photograph by Vic Muniz, for example, does not show the suffering girl that Nick Ut photographed, and as such became the emblem of the Vietnam War, as we saw this morning in Tom Mitchell's presentation. The image Tom showed this morning already suggested in the trail of caricatures he showed in its wake how a unique picture becomes a recycled image. This version here is only a drawing after that Muniz made without consulting the image, after his childhood memory of the image. This, I think, comes in a sense close to the closed boxes. He did not consult the image when he made the drawing, then he photographed the drawing. Thus, the show in Williamstown also focused primarily on the media of representation, the selection as well as the order of presentation, and as I later found out, the installation managed to avoid the reiterative effect, the moralistic rhetoric, and the Schadenfreude I had been repulsed by. So, from rejecting, I accepted, then wholeheartedly endorsed the request and the whole endeavor. This was a turning point in my resistance against images of violence. I began to see the point of such exhibitions on the condition that they do, indeed, effectively compel an unease that leads to reflection. I think image counter image does this even more radically and consistently. In the Williams project, the issues and problems did not go away. Instead, they became the heart of the project. And when I walk through the exhibition here, I see them come up again, albeit in different ways, through different artworks, and more radically. Some of the talks today have brought them up again. To sum it up, through Alfredo's signature statement, it is difficult indeed. Much of our discussions today have circled around those difficulties. The diffuse quality of emotion in encounters with such images is for me problem number one in the Traffic of Pain, the exhibition Beautiful Suffering analyzed and questioned, and to an extent also inevitably and boldly performed. And so does this exhibition, 5 years later. It is the problem of sentimentality, of an identification that either appropriates someone else's pain in what Dominic Capra has called vicarious suffering, or exploits it to feel oneself feeling. This feeling oneself feeling fulfills a need in a time of indifference, when the overflow of visual representations of suffering tends to inure one to the confrontation. This encourages people to either feel good about themselves, as in what Tom Hollard has called the certain exhaustion, disaffection, or lassitude, and it cultivates indifference. And art, as was said today, as Tom said today, Tom Hollert, can use, quote, all kinds of gaps and voids of untranslatability to counter the media boasting of full information. The resulting exchange is too unfair. Years ago or miles away, people were dying or killing one another, and I would be enjoying myself in a photo exhibition of beauty in its conjunction with suffering. Something is wrong here. Walter Benjamin's work remains a storehouse of excellent starting points, the kind of crude thinking through which Georges argues in his catalogue essay. The key questions remain inside. What is this an image of? Simple, but important. To whom does it belong, and how does it do its visual work? Even if the answer is, it belongs to no one, as has been said today. So in the face of these difficulties, how do artists and their critics deal with the difficulty? Tom Mitchell, after expressing a sane resistance against this very question of how, said that the method he adheres to might be that every image has, is, and creates a counter-image. It comes from, is, and produces counter-image. Hence, this method is to look for the counter-image in the past, the present, and the future. Michael Diers, or Michael Diers, I don't know how you like to say your name, then practiced something like this method in a detailed analysis and demonstrated its productivity. His patient analysis gave insight into the past, the genre of the group photo, for example, and the anatomical lesson. The present, the insistence on the act of watching, of looking, of the people in the photo, and the future, the political effect of the photo produced by what he called its iconopolitics. In his lecture on Farocchi's work, based on the Benjaminian notion that history is the history of suffering, Georges invoked the inspiration of Brecht and Warburg in his call for a mode of image making and looking that overcomes the two extremes of sentimentality and abstraction. He calls his alternative third person, in analogy with the linguistic structures, to counter the tendency to sentimentality. For abstraction, to which I will return later, we could take the US-issued television imagery of the First Gulf War, totally unreadable night shots, presenting a war between machines rather than people. These were abstract indeed, but then that judgment depends on how we define abstraction. Together, the two problems of sentimentality and beauty receive a specifically problematic nuance in the face of photography, the medium that, as Oakley and Weser reminded us, remains so troublesomely bound up with reality. With photographs of human subjects who suffer, it is not possible to dream away in awe of artistic mastery. The figures of the images, in the images, as much as the artwork, question the indifference of aesthetics and wonder about the politics that inform it, as well as the possibility of politically effective art. They make us wonder, is this political art, or is it voyeuristic journalism, or journalism as political intervention, or is it propaganda? And what does it tell us? That sometimes the difference is hard to make out. The questions of empathy, sympathy, or identification, of bottomless but also directionless emotion, as well as the seemingly opposite question of aesthetics and its required disinterestedness, according to the Kantian Vulgatum, are bound up with the most obvious problem of the representation of conflict through media that somehow remain bound up with reality and truth. And then the traffic in pain concerns exploitation. The third problem, such shows race, then concerns the economic part of traffic. More than any other art form, photography of people confronts us with the economic injustice of an exchange where the subject is exposed, even in her most painful and intimate moments, while the maker cashes the earnings the viewer is willing to give. It is their imminent death, their pain, their poverty, disease, woundedness, or deprivation that is exposed for the world to see, but not to cure. Their exposure makes them vulnerable. while the reason they are here on display is that they are already wounded. Their exposure is someone else's merchandise. I have always found Steve McCurry's use of the so-called Afghan girl exploitative. And I like to think that her direct look at the viewer makes her as resistant as, say, Manet's Olympia. This is an instance of the inter-iconicity Patricia Dander invoked in her wonderful encompassing catalogue essay. Yet, as with Tom and Michael's lectures this morning, I always remain slightly uneasy with iconography, suspecting it of an over-focus on similarity, until I had to make iconographic images myself for a fiction film that connects madness with violence. Here's one example of the use of iconography to make a point. The references serve in the film to convey from the past that the mental illness of depression, as well as the triumphant gesture, are both sides of the violence generating of madness that underlies the two sides, even if in the same late medieval figure. So this figure is representing two sides that is like a schizophrenic situation. What I want to suggest is that iconography must include affect. Similarity in outline, pose, and composition is not all that can be dialogically engaged through iconography. If you allow me to slightly complicate this useful notion of inter-iconicity, I allege this case of Sasnal in a similar inter-iconicity. The brutally frontal image of the dead body of Gaddafi, with the obscenely eager takers of trophy photographs, is inter-iconically related to the Mantegna dead Christ, Patricia notes in her essay. But also, I would contend, to Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Damon, the other of the one that Michael commented on this morning. This inter-iconicity, like the Afghan girl's insolent, confrontational eyes looking back at us like Olympia, includes the affective charge, or, as the case may be here, the lack of it. The violence pornographer is more similar to scholars and teachers who believe in affectless information than to the death of Christ, whose victim at least is mourned, as Patricia says herself in the essay. Moreover, the obscene hole between Gaddafi's legs mirrors the hole in the diamond corpse, but displaces it from the belly downwards. We may need Sigmund Freud to understand the social implications of it, but not to see castration. Art exhibitions, routinely mounted to show a body of work, most frequently of an artist, a movement, or a period, but sometimes thematically selected and presented, are quite specific qua visual event. The term visual event is meant to draw attention to the specific situation in which a visual artifact appears, is looked at, absorbed, and further defined by its viewers. The term foregrounds a refusal to consider artworks as autonomous objects that travel through time and space in self-same identity. As such, exhibitions both cater to a public and discuss with that public. They are potentially forms of thought. And I think that came up quite a few times, but I would like to insist on that. They do not present the truth, but thought about the issue of the truth. That would be my conclusion from this afternoon's panel discussion. To the way such thought is possible, Georges has devoted his analysis of Farocchi's work. The exhibition can be seen as continuing, modifying, and reconfirming the practice of self-conscious creative curating with a commitment to art as thought. Yes, it is difficult. I'm not sure the opposition Alfredo establishes in a text that I got, but I didn't hear him say it in the presentation today, between language and pictures, holds in general, since language can also be misused for obscuring and erasing and even for for pornography. And, as Alfredo beautifully demonstrates, it can be used for visual representation. His black boxes in this exhibition do precisely that. They describe. This is one way of soliciting vision, and it is the kind of vision that I think is not fundamentally different from the image. I just mentioned a seminal text with which Tom Mitchell opened his book in 1985 called Iconography, where he unpacks the widely differing conceptual ramification of the word image. Description is one of such ramifications. Nevertheless, I admire Alfredo's relentless, ongoing struggle against the oblivion and abuse perpetrated by images. His work, The Eyes of Cutete Emerita, and I feel both justified to bring it up, although it's not in this exhibition, because he mentioned it and showed it, and I feel really embarrassed that the photo that I have of the eyes is very, very bad, because I had to scan it from the book. This work, for me, is the key work about the issue that I'm talking about. It remains the most important work when it comes to the necessary critique of visual representation of violence. For the visitors of the exhibition, these photographs and videos are hard to look at. But this time, in this exhibition, not because they represent pain, but because they refuse to represent it, and thereby pose difficulties of readability. The difficulty of representing suffering is not, as is customary, naturalized, but foregrounded without being performed. It does not happen in this exhibition. Here, the difficulty of undirected emotions, vicarious guilt, indifference as a shield to bear it, and secondary exploitation is the principle, but also the question underlying the show. No image just represents it. It is its proposed attitude or mode of looking mobilized so that this mode of looking can be filled with, redirected towards reflection and self-reflection. Don't misunderstand me, this exhibition is not didactic because it doesn't have a single message to drive home. My second motif for enthusiasm, the second compliment, the multitude, is the fact that all works exhibited explore a different relationship between conflict and media. And I was blown away by the success of that differentiation, that multitude of relations. They're all different. This ranges from a critical probing of the apparatus of beauty as distance, of repainting, of collecting, of, quote, arresting the image flow, to use Tom Hollett's phrase, of the ambivalence of the photographer, the subject and their relationship in Shibley's work, and different forms of abstraction, on which more in a minute. Instead of a simplistic didacticism, this exhibition is philosophical, exposing in a visual discourse thoughts without ending, problems without solutions, questions viscerally absorbed and which are not answered on the spot. True philosophy, whether or not in the form of the essay that George has discussed with Farocki's work, does not bear closing conclusions. This show is an instance of a critical visual reflection that I think is on a par with the best philosophy. But this two-step process, where primary encounters and gut responses are redirected into cultural philosophy, may not automatically work. And what we would then be left with is precisely that dark complex of sentimentality, enjoyment, and superiority. The cultural genre of the exhibition itself cannot be simply refocused. It's hard work. It is difficult to do that. As the other exhibition demonstrates, it brings with it a heritage of precisely the problematic but culturally entrenched attitudes I have indicated, even if the exhibition aims to undermine it. And to be honest, for me, this the problem of that repetition of something from the past is in Hitler's voice in the exhibition. I found that too loud to bear. Moreover, an exhibition that is thematic rather than historical or monographic requires, indeed imposes, a certain unification. Elements of framing provide this unity, without which the exhibition would make no sense to most. Framing, thus, was a topic that we haven't explicitly discussed so much, but implied a lot. And one example of a frame is Trevor's calling himself an experimental geographer. This binds his art, explains it, and designates its relation to the truth it seeks and seeks to deconstruct. And a frame of a totally different kind is the material difficulty that Roy had to do what he intended to do in Egypt. The title of an exhibition is also a frame. It is not the only element that promotes, in the first instance, a troublesome mode of looking that includes counterlooking. Although the fact that it is what attracts visitors in the first place is food for thought. A title is important. Tom Hollard ended his talk on the insufficiency, on a critique of the insufficiency of the language of counter. But then, counter is itself plurisemic enough. As Ahlam Shibli's ambivalent subjects demonstrate, the counter of the image can endlessly be mise en abîme, as the French would say. Let me phrase bluntly what a show like this is up against. Put any number of such photographs together and the hardship vanishes. One cannot sustain the difficulty through the confrontation with so many photographs, and hence must shed it and move on. Aesthetic appreciation, the standard mode of looking at exhibitions, is ready to help out. This is a general issue that pertains to exhibition itself as a cultural event or genre. But the bringing together of these images under this exhibition's concept poses an additional problem, namely that of the visibility or invisibility of suffering. On the one hand, this exhibition stands out for the variety of relationships between war and media it proposes. On the other hand, it has made the suffering of war all but invisible. However, with the recurrence of images of suffering in the everyday visual culture of the West, it seems that less is more. The more difficult it is to actually see the suffering, the more we step into the relationality that art critic Jill Bennett advocates in her book Empathic Vision. She does not mean at all by this term Nicolas Bourriaud's relational art, but something more difficult, pertaining to what the viewer does, and what at most the image encourages, sometimes compels, in its specific performativity. And again, the term performativity has not been extensively discussed today, but I only need to remind you of Alfredo's presentation, and we know what the term means. The emergence of new possible forms is an additional tool for this passage to relationality. This explains Jill Bennett's preference for art that cannot be construed as realistic, and this becomes then something like abstraction. Alfredo, I'm really sorry about the quality of this. Alfredo's frame of the eyes that saw, passing quickly, so I'll pass quickly, visible briefly, in that emblematic work from 1996, brings to awareness the question of whose images we see. This key work recalls that never fully acknowledged and all but condoned genocide in Rwanda, while people continue to kill others for who or what they are, which is the definition of genocide. And this raises the question that came up, how do you respond to all these other conflicts that are currently going on? And I think that keeping this focus almost obsessively on Rwanda is a very important point that Alfredo is making. This work helps us reconfigure abstraction in a way that circumvents the risks of this visual mode. I'm now going to go back to abstraction, the other side of sentimentality that George's analysis and Farocchi's work attempt to overcome. Three manifestations of abstraction are combined in Alfredo's work, but also in Monica Huber's paintings. For example, I'm here leaning on Deleuze's discussion of abstraction in Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus. First, the necessary, but by definition insufficient supplementarity between the image and the accompanying writing produces a domain of possible forms. Alternating full, half-empty, and nearly empty frames of text insist on the wavering, unfulfilled potential of this supplementary relationship. No theorization of word-image relations has been adequate to explain this wavering. This is for the better. Only before the realization of form can abstraction deploy its potential. That is, before the box is opened, and it never will. For the relational viewer to take up and elaborate in that unpredictable encounter between individual subject and public exhibition. This abstraction of possible form does not erase but creates, with the viewer as involved participant. This is why I would prefer not to call the alternative third-person discourse, but perhaps first, second-person plural. We'll have an argument about that with George, but I find George's argument on this matter convincing up to the point where he seems to wish to get rid of the category of person in the attempt to validate impersonality as a leap away from sentimentality, but perhaps forgetting his earlier caution against abstraction as well as his insistence on intensity. Intensity can move between things and people, but the people remain a partner in this. It is also why I do not reject images and why I find Alfredo's text boxes comparable with Huber's paintings. Second, both Alfredo's key work and Monica's work we see here has literally abstracted the figure, and this is the second notion of abstraction, reduced her to her eyes only. Where Alfredo comments in the accompanying text that all but takes the work over, spatially as well as temporally, that I remember her eyes. I'm referring here to the installation in Williamstown, but he just brought this up in a very different installation. I remember her eyes. I think that is the key phrase. He proposes the relationality of witnessing, perhaps best aligned to a form of what Patricia Dander, borrowing from Hito Styro, calls documentality, but then not in the service of governmentality and the rhetoric of truth, but instead as a documentality of the people who are touched by the violence and their sovereignty. In terms of truth, I have heard little about the fact that in some sense all the works in this exhibition are autobiographical in a fundamental way. Trevor, who wants to be a geographer, wants to understand the world. That is his personal desire. The autobiographical act of relating and the memorial aspect of its belatedness as a way of performing relationality, when always radically belatedly, we gather to witness the violence that has already killed. And that's why this focus on Rwanda remains important in the present. The reduction of figures to eyes is of course not incidental. I am looking at the eyes that looked at the emperor, Roland Barthes wrote at the opening of Camera Lucida, his most autobiographical book. Those eyes of Gutete Emerita, like those of Monica's woman, carry the imprint of witnessing the murder of her family, then the seeing of the earth where the bodies lay rotting. Traces of Gutete. These eyes are also traces of what they saw. And that includes Jair himself, who saw her and attempted to enter those eyes and see with her, seeing for, as Bennett has it, to achieve empathic unsettlement. Is this abstraction? No, in one sense it is emphatic figuration, the foregrounding of a detail of the person, but one that stands synecdochically for the person and her entire being, her body, her life, her history. On the other hand, the reduction or subtraction opens up new possible forms. We don't have the woman's physical appearance in front of us to distract us, as Adorno would say, from seeing for her. The forms we make encompass a world of suffering that these eyes carry with them, but that we cannot appropriate. Instead, we can make it. The most important form of the Deleuzian abstraction this work embodies, its third lies, however, in the shift from visual not to linguistic but to temporal. Not only is the body reduced to the eyes, but those eyes flash by in the installation where I saw it only very briefly. And I try to express that by showing the eyes behind the text. The text carries most of the weight of the piece. This brief flash, in combination with the total darkness in the built-in room, confronts the viewer with the difficulty of holding fast to the past, to put it in the present. Like memory, this memorial to a woman who saw her family being murdered touches the viewer now and then, but not at will. Much like the return of an unmasterable trauma, the possibility to see the eyes and see for Goethe or others who are doomed to witness. The preposition for, obviously, cannot mean instead of, but with, and thus in support of, through an act of testimony's performative quality as a humanizing transactive process. This is a quote from Ernst van Alphen. With this formulation, I'd like to propose a solution to Tom Hollard's dilemma of opacity. This transactive process is for me the underlying issue after, so to speak, the media critique, the counter, the title of the exhibition intimates. And true to Deleuzian abstraction, this exhibition that does not show any clearly visible violence opens endless possibility to imagine not only what the violence is, on whom it is perpetrated, but also how we can bear witness, remain in the present, and bring the past horror into the present tense. Yes, it is difficult. The brief flashing of Goethe's eyes is not only a confrontation with traumatic memory, as this image is also her memory, not ours, but also a sense-based confrontation with the difficulty of keeping in touch with the past. The belabored process of repainting suggests a solidarity in that difficulty. I think the value of that repainting that we have seen in several works in the exhibition lies in that labor. The speed with which Goethe's eyes flash by is painful. One wants to see the eyes again. Hence, one lingers in the dark room longer and longer. Just as one looks at the unreadable images longer and longer. I spent a lot of time in this Huber room because I wanted to understand what was on the image. Looking cannot keep up with the pace of the images that flash by us in everyday life as much as in this exhibition. But there, they are slowed down by unreadability, and that's the value of that form of abstraction. This is an excellent alternative for the only tool we possess to counter the enduring numbing effect, and that word came up, and I forgot where exactly at what moment, but the numbing effect of that speed is to stop and look and keep looking. Not so much taking the time, as the phrase has it, but giving it, as Derrida recoined the phrase. The utter paradox, then, of Alfredo's key work is that it deploys speed to bodily enforce slowness in looking. And that is, for me, why it is such a foundational work in this area. The temporal abstraction this work stages for us is ultimately also a statement on how little political art can really do. It's just a flash. But this flash is crucial. Again, we must call on Walter Benjamin. Quote, "Every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably." Who would disagree with Benjamin's powerful and frequently quoted fifth thesis An image of the past only matters for the present when it is seen, quote, as one of its own concerns. Rwanda is the concern of the present, in other words, and that's what Alfredo's work is saying. If it is not identified as such, the image will disappear. And since extinction is forever, according to the ecological slogan, the question that needs to be raised could be phrased as follows. How can art prevent the extinction of the past so that the present can make it matter for itself? First of all, through images of it, images that represent the past, that come to us from the past, and that make the past matter for the present. Those are the three meanings of the preposition of that resonate in Benjamin's sentence. The operative verb in his urgent warning is to recognize. In light of Benjamin's view of the need to make images matter for the present, the question rises, what we as viewers do with images, such as the ones that we see in this exhibition. The images of the past must be recognized, and recognized in their relevance for the present, so that we can effectively bring them to bear on the present. And I'm not suggesting that that present is the Arab Spring, because the images that Roy shows, with all the difficulty and the different material that he had to use, are already of the past if we fail to recognize that they are of today, of now, in Syria, if not in Egypt, although also in Egypt. The penalty for failing to do so is the irretrievable loss, not simply of the past, but of its images, hence also of the three forms of relevance that the preposition of suggests they have in Benjamin's quote. The two meanings of recognition, one cognitive, to know again, and one social, to give acknowledgement to recognize something as, are bound up together. In both senses, recognition pertains to the dialectic of similarity, of repetition, and of a difference or innovation that constitutes representation. The cognitive sense insists on similarity in the new act, hence on similarity and innovation as two distinct moments in time, whereas the social sense intimate similarity between self and other as both equipped to take the roles of first and second person in turns. Time and intersubjectivity are thus at issue in the concept of recognition, as they are too in Benjamin's statement. Alfredo Ja's final sentence in an email that he sent to the curators untiringly keeps problematizing even the best meant efforts, yet also remains almost utopian in the task of images he outlines. Quote, we should be able to memorialize without victimizing again. But in the face of the indifference that actively produces the disasters of war and famine that underlies so much of the suffering on which the show and its photographs reflect, a flash is better than nothing. Moreover, it is still slower than the pace of that indifference. Is it a coincidence that the economic term interest, a tool to make money with the instrumental help of time, is also at the root of that utter cliché term of aesthetic engagement? Interesting. How interesting. But what Jair cum Gutator's flashing eyes seem to say is the interest Kant wanted the contemplator of beauty to take distance from. Is it interest as in money, interest as in superficial, self-gratifying looking, or interest as commitment, concern, that leads beyond its moment, in the more Habermasian sense? This question brings us back to the beginning, the first encounters that this show has staged for its visitors. Perhaps I should be true to my definition of a philosophical exhibition, where understanding occurs through images and has no ending, and say no more. Thank you.